Welcome to the program, Colonel Sweet.
Hey, thanks for having me back on, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Iran has attacked Israel with more than 300 drones and missiles. US President Joe Biden said that the US armed forces had helped Israel to shoot down nearly all of Iranian drones and missiles. The United Kingdom and France also assisted Israel in the air. Many Ukrainians wonder, why can't the US and its allies do the same in Ukraine?
That's a great question, and one I think many people here in the United States have the same question too. I think the truth of the matter is it's just distance. The repercussions from Russia obviously are very close to Europe and presents a much bigger threat than any repercussions that Iran threats that provides to Europe. So I think that's a part of it. But yeah, it's obviously a situation that has put many people in a difficult position.
Do you expect Israel to strike back, and what could be the possible targets for the Israeli armed forces?
Absolutely, and the chief of military forces there in Israel has already said that they are going to strike back. So, yes, we believe that they will be a retaliatory strike. That you just can't allow 300 missiles to be fired from Iran into Israel and not respond. Look, the likely targets from my perspective are going to be the biggest threats to them right now. That is IRGC, particularly leadership, troop formations, but also some of their infrastructure and bases. Also believe they're probably going to go after some of the nuclear research facilities. That poses a much larger threat in the immediate future. So they're going to send that message. They'll also go after their capabilities to generate revenue, and that's their oil platforms and refineries. And the worst case scenario is that they actually go up that escalation ladder, as many people have said, and that's start to look at targets within the Iranian regime itself.
Also, it seems like the US government advised Israel not to retaliate to Iran. Would you support such an advice?
So I believe the actual advice the message that the president provided, the prime minister, was that the United States government was not going to support Israel in this retaliatory strike, that the position of the United States is that they are a defensive platform, not an offensive platform. So from that perspective, I can accept that, but support, they'll still need some type of support in the ways of intelligence and aerial refueling. Israel is going to do what Israel does. And for Israel, the threat of Iran and the security of their countries at stake, and they're going to take matters into their own hands.
Also, US President Joe Biden had told Israeli Prime Minister that the US would not support any offensive actions against Iran. From your perspective, is that the same fear of escalation that also limits US support for Ukraine?
I do. It's the escalation fear, and they've said it themselves. The Secretary of State said it. His spokesman has said it. John Kirby has said is that they don't want to widen the war and they don't want to escalate the war. So escalation paralysis is still very much a real phenomenon in Washington, D.C. But the problem with not escalating or the problem with not responding is that it tends to send the wrong message to Iran. Also sends the wrong message to Russia that there's not going to be a response, and we'll continue the activities that we're doing, and we'll even step up those activities in the absence of a U.S. response.
Given the current international pressure on Israel not to retaliate and to de-escalate, what could be the best option for the Israeli government to respond in order to maintain this also international support?
Yeah, right now, obviously the threat to Israel is the bombardment, the aerial attack. But you have to remember also that there's still the proxies that we have to contend with. When I say we, Israel, the United States, and the remainder of the region. So you still have Hamas, Palestinian Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis. So that's still a threat. That poses a threat to all of the countries in the Middle East. But no, there's no easy way of doing this. It's complicated. It's difficult. No one's going to be happy with any response or any type of action, which is why Israel is going to take the security of their own country more at stake than they are on other opinions outside of their country.
How do you see the current risks for a wider conflict in the Middle East right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. A wider conflict, I'm assuming you mean countries outside of Iran that would support them, possibly China, North Korea, or Russia, or even Pakistan. Right now, I haven't seen that level of support, at least in the media, we haven't seen it, of threats of retaliation or support. I do believe that they may be provided intelligence, they may be provided some additional weapons. Remember, Iran's not a force projection country. Iran is a country that's relied upon missiles primarily, but fighter jets. They also have control to some extent of the waterways with the IRGC Navy. But again, they're not a force projection, so they're not a physical threat on the ground to Israel as far as an invasion, but they do present a significant threat. And again, the thought of a wider war would bring not only those supporting Iran, but those other countries, those Sunni Arab countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, that have a softer stance towards Israel, possibly bringing them in if they are involved in the actual activities. In this case, we saw violations of airspace, particularly in Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia last night or Sunday night.
It seems like the recent attack by Iran on Israel could have some political benefits for the Israeli government. The West has shifted its attention on the Israeli strikes on aid workers to the recent attack by Iran. What is your take on that?
I guess to some extent, it certainly is, as we like to say, the shiny light that the media is gravitating towards. So many things many stories have become buried. So the story with the assault on the relief workers has been buried, but equally as important is Ukraine's been buried. You haven't heard much within the media on what's going on in Ukraine and the threats that are currently going on with Kharkiv in other areas. So no, it is the shiny light that everyone's focused on, because right now, quite honestly, everyone's focused on the possibility that Iran's going to retaliate. And then the next thing they're going to focus on is whether Israel retaliates. The next piece would be how Iran retaliates. So right now we're in a tit for tat. They like to call it an escalation ladder, but sooner or later, the ladder is going to get to its peak. And we'll see how it plays out.
Let's cover also the war in Ukraine. If there is a big escalation in the Middle East, how could it influence the war in Ukraine and the support from our Western allies?
Support from the Western allies right now, I think, particularly from the European base, is still, when I read the papers and look at the social media, we have 7 countries now that have security agreements with Ukraine. We have another 2 countries, Poland and Romania, that are looking to sign security agreements. You have coalition efforts to get more artillery led by the Czech Republic and by France. So you have a very active European base that's filling in the gap right now in the absence of the United States, which quite frankly hasn't been part of the solution now since November. Now that could possibly change this week as the folks in Washington, D.C. are looking at least yesterday, the proposal from Speaker Johnson was to divide the support packages into 4 separate bills, which included a support package of nearly $49 billion for Ukraine. So we'll see where that goes. The attention's still there. They're still working those issues, but surely everything right now that's going on in the Middle East has a much higher, as far as the media is concerned, a much higher profile than what's going on in Ukraine.
Given that House of Representatives would vote on Ukraine aid this Friday, does that mean that the situation, the escalation on the Middle East forced lawmakers to act?
Well, I think it certainly provided some additional urgency. That they realize that there's multiple contingencies that they had to contend with. The biggest threat to the United States right now is, in my opinion, the biggest threat is the security of Europe. Israel right now can protect itself. The Iron Dome, the layered defensive belts that they have to protect themselves against aerial bombardments proved itself. And you said this earlier, but 99% of the missiles and drones that were fired towards Israel were defeated. So Israel's in a comfortable position that they know and they're confident in that layered defense. Ukraine doesn't have that. I mean, Ukraine's getting bombarded daily right now. The latest epicenter for those missiles is Kharkiv, and that's the biggest threat right now for Ukraine.
Do you believe that House representatives would finally get Ukraine aid done this week?
I believe that if the Speaker puts forth the vote for Ukraine, that a sizable number of Republicans will vote along with the majority of the Democrats to get that package through. Yes, I do. Right now, what's interesting enough is that the White House is against dividing the four bills into separate bills. They want a consolidated bill. So whether or not the White House objects or tries to intervene in that, I guess is probably the next story. But I do believe the House is going to pass individual bills, and in this case, Ukraine First for $49 billion.
The Washington Post reported that the US officials had urged Ukraine to halt any strikes on Russia's oil refineries. White House is concerned that such strikes could rise global oil prices. Pentagon officials say that such strikes by Ukraine have questionable military value. How do you see the military value of these strikes?
Well, so the military value from our position, when I say our position, Mark Toth and I wrote about this in several of our articles in both The Hill and the New York Post. But the military value of those facilities is the revenue that oil brings in. And that revenue is used to pay for additional troops and military equipment and ammunition that's funding the war in Ukraine. So it does have an effect. I believe that, according to Bloomberg, that upwards to 12% of their capacity was affected. So that's a decent amount of money. And again, that's a legitimate target if that target's being used to fund the war. And I think Ukraine realizes that. From the United States perspective, at least from some of the statements that we saw, they're concerned about the impact on the global market and the global economy. And that's understandable, but from a Ukraine perspective, it's about survivability. It is about affecting what they can affect. And right now, they're having difficulty affecting the close fight, battle in the trenches. They're having a difficulty affecting the interdiction fight, which is the troops that are coming in and the equipment are coming in. But organically, with their own drones, they're able to affect the strategic fight, the deep fight that goes to funding the war. And right now, that's the tool that they're employing while they continue to build combat power.
If you were a presidential advisor to the President Zelensky, would you advise him to continue strikes on Russia's oil refineries and military targets inside Russia?
My advice to him would be this multi-domain offensive, counteroffensive that they employed, or that they began employing 12 months ago at this time, was effective. It was putting Russia on their heels. So you had the long distance strikes that were going into the Crimean Peninsula that were affecting Russia's ability to sustain their forces. It took out the Russian Navy. It affected the Kerch Street Bridge. It was affecting the refineries and some of the airfields, the deeper airfields within Russia. They were employing, or they were benefiting from anti-Putin forces that were attacking along the Russian border. They were attacking locally. They were attacking deep. And I got to imagine that to some degree there's some cyber that's going on also, an information campaign. So my recommendation would be keep your foot on the gas as far as that's concerned, but they have to continue to leverage the West in order to get them the weapons and the ammunition that they need. Look, more is not necessarily better. What's better is specifically pinpointing the exact requirements. 155 munitions, cluster munitions, precision deep strike munitions in the form of Shadow, Scout, Taurus, ATACMS, F-16s. Eventually, if they get into another counteroffensive, they're going to need bridging capability. They're going to need increased medical capability. So they have to build that combat power. And it's not just armor and APCs, but it's the entirety of the combined arms team. It's air, land, sea. It's one supporting the other. And right now they don't have that. Right now they are in a position the way they found themselves nearly 12 months ago with Bakhmut, and prior to the counteroffensive. They're in a defensive posture and they're looking for ways to break out. And right now it's getting that 800,000 rounds of munitions that the Czech Republic says they've secured. Estonia said they found some more. But finding things on the open market and building capacity are two different things. And I think the biggest disappointment that many of us share is that the European Union, NATO, and the United States simply haven't increased capacity as far as munitions to get that to them. It's just frustrating to watch as we continue to look for things on the market as opposed to actually provide those resources.
If Congress passes Ukraine aid, can it change dynamics of the war?
It certainly will help. Look, right now, Ukraine has to stop the bleeding. And when I say stop the bleeding, they're giving terrain. There's a mobile defense that they're fighting, and they're doing phenomenal with the assets that they have. What Kiev Post today said 455,000 was the casualty rate for Russians. They're doing the best they have with the tools they have. But more money is going to help. It will help stop the bleed as far as getting them the weapons and the air defense assets they need to survive. But in order to win, they need a plan. And right now, we're just not seeing a plan. We're seeing reaction. React to air defense, react to ground attacks. But we're not seeing the plan that says this is what we're going to do to win the war. This is what we're going to do to push Russia out of the country. Not regime change. We're talking push them out of the country and reestablish the integrity of the country. So the plan's missing. The money's great. The weapons are great. But unless there's a plan, it's going to continue to be we need more. And as Mark and I say, it's a forever war, and it just you just continue to sustain combat. You don't win combat.
How do you see this plan to achieve victory for Ukraine?
Yeah, so it's obviously multi-phase. Obviously, the first phase is to stop the bleeding. Okay, and that means you got to stop the relentless attacks that are coming from Russia into Ukraine, which means you got to get them those 155 artillery munitions. You got to get them more javelins. You got to get them close air support in the form maybe of jet fighters. So you have to win the close fight. You have to fend off the deep fight. And when I say the deep fight, I'm talking the ballistic missiles and the drones and the cruise missiles that are being fired into them. You have to be able to defeat that. You defeat it not necessarily by shooting them out of the sky, which is a technique. But the better technique is to destroy the weapon platform where it's firing the missile from in the storage facilities and eliminating the crews. The next thing they have to do is that they have to fight the war of interdiction. They have to defeat Russian forces before they get into Ukraine. That means stopping them and destroying them in their assembly areas, destroying their soldiers, destroying the equipment. You can't wait for them to arrive on the battlefield to fight the battle. It is an endless close fight if you do that. The only way to create room is to defeat them in the close fight, defeat them in the interdictionary fight, and then move your forces forward and re-secure terrain. So they have to be able to do that. And simultaneously, they have to be able to affect, and the effect is what we talked about earlier, affect Russia's ability to wage war, affect Russia's ability to want to support war, okay? I don't see an information campaign either by NATO or the United States that's pushing that message into Russia. Russia's pushing the message out that they're the victims, that they're doing what they can, that it's all about defending Russia. But we're not doing anything I don't believe, a campaign that says that it's a losing battle. You've lost 455,000. You're going to lose more. This is Putin's war. It's not your war. I'd like to see more of that, and I'd like to see from the Ukraine's position. Obviously, I like to see. More, when I say more aggression, but at least a plan from their perspective too. The objectives. We know the objectives are Crimea. We know the objectives also are getting Russian forces out of the Donbass. They can do both, but they're going to have to build combat power. And right now, combat powers in the form of weapon systems that they're waiting for, the F-16s and the artillery. But those deep strike systems that they need, we're not seeing it. Germany's balking, the United States is balking, and again, I think escalation is a key part of that. But eventually, all the European countries realize that if Ukraine falls, Russia is not going to stop.
What kind of development on the ground or around the globe can force the United States and its allies to provide Ukraine with all what is needed for the victory, with all weapons that you have mentioned in your answer?
I'm not sure anything forces any of the European countries or the United States to do anything. I think what's going to create the conditions for them to be more engaged, to provide those actual systems, is if we see a Russia breakout. Right now, we haven't seen Russia be able to break out. Ukraine's mobile defense has been very effective in stopping the assaults, okay? And by all documents that we see for British intelligence, but also the Ukrainian intelligence, Ukraine's killing upwards of 750 to 1,000 Russian soldiers a day, along with their associated tanks and BMPs. But they're not able to affect what's coming into the country. So Russia is more than able to continue to backfill those numbers, and they do it on a daily basis, and they continue to push. I agree with General Hodges, the former U.S. Army European commander, when he says this is about mass. And right now, mass is capable of winning. Technology should win, but mass right now is capable of winning because the technology and the weapon systems that Ukraine needs are in short supply, and Russia is able to overwhelm the defenders with sheer volume of personnel. You don't need rocket scientists. You just need a body inside that uniform to go forward with their weapon system. And then artillery. Let's talk artillery. Right now, the ratio of artillery disparity is 5-1. For every 5 shells that Russia is firing, Ukraine's firing 1. And according to the NATO commander, within weeks, that ratio could change from 10-1, 10 in favor of Russia, 1 to Ukraine. So we really need to get onto the production aspect of these artillery rounds and get them to Ukraine so they can fight. Look, you don't want a fair fight, but you want to overwhelm them, okay? Fighting fair fights isn't how you win wars, but you have to stop the bleeding. And right now, stopping the bleeding means winning a close fight and interdicting Russian forces.
Financial Times reported that Russia can launch another full-scale offensive in Ukraine in the late spring or summer and try to capture Kharkiv. What are Russia's chances to do that right now?
Well, we're already seeing right now that Russia's laying the framework for Kharkiv. For the last several months, they've been bombing Kharkiv relentlessly. There's also been reports that Russia has mobilized an additional 150,000 to 300,000 soldiers that they're going to use in that particular offensive. So again, it comes down to how do you interdict that? How do you affect that before it arrives on the battlefield? It's too late when you're fighting them in a close engagement. You need to destroy them before they arrive on the battlefield. And that means, that means HIMARS, that means 155, that means cluster munitions, that means close air support. And that means, to some extent, special operation forces in the rear, disrupting rail lines, disrupting transportation, taking out airfields, aircraft that are supporting the close battle. So it's likely, and I think Russia certainly sees Kharkiv as one of their objectives. And the strike, at least the airstrikes that we saw in Iran right now, have certainly taken the focus off of Ukraine and allowing Russia to be able to maneuver more, at least from underneath the scrutiny of the media. We saw that again on October 9th when Russia invaded Akivia. 2 days after the Hamas attack in Israel. That was, again, all eyes had shifted towards Israel, and then Russia was able to launch a massive counteroffensive during that time. So we're starting to see things repeat itself on the battlefield.
Thank you, Colonel Sweet, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me back on, Daniel. I appreciate it.